At my wife's dad's birthday party, my name tag said the disappointment. My wife and everyone laughed. Well, it's true. So I stood up, clinked my glass, and said, I'd like to make a toast to the last time you'll ever see me. My wife choked, but the real shock came when I walked out the door and left behind one final. Let me tell you what it's like to be worth 9 figures and still feel like the help. My name is Gavin Mercer, and I'm 34 years old, which in startup years makes me practically ancient, but in family money years makes me the kid who got lucky with computers. I'm the founder and CEO of LexPilot, a legal tech SaaS platform that uses AI and machine learning to automate due diligence, contract review, and compliance workflows for law firms and in-house legal teams. We closed our Series B round 6 months ago. $42 million, led by Andreessen Horowitz with participation from General Catalyst and a handful of strategic angels who actually understand what we're building. My personal portfolio reads like a diversified hedge fund wet dream. Quiet limited partner stakes in 2 private equity funds, Blackstone and KKR, if you must know, a few venture capital sidecars that throw off decent returns, and enough liquid assets to buy a small country or at least a really nice neighborhood in Manhattan. On paper, my life looks like it was curated by someone's personal shopper with unlimited credit. Tom Ford suits hanging in my closet like expensive armor, a Tesla Model S Plaid in the garage that can do 0 to 60 faster than most people can process rejection, and an Upper West Side penthouse with windows that frame the city like it's a painting I commissioned. But here's the thing about marrying into old money. You quickly learn that new money, no matter how many zeros it has, will always be treated like monopoly money by people who've never had to actually earn theirs. My wife, Sloan Whitmore, is what you'd call genetically engineered for success. She's a litigation associate at her father's legacy firm, Whitmore & Lyle LLP, the kind of white shoe establishment that makes other white shoe establishments feel insecure about their pedigree. This is a law firm that was founded when contracts were still written with quill pens and the concept of billable hours was just a gleam in some sadistic partner's eye. They wear their tradition like medieval armor, heavy, restrictive, and completely impractical for modern warfare, but damn impressive when you're trying to intimidate the peasants. Her father, Justice Harold Whitmore, is a retired appellate judge who still speaks like he's delivering verdicts from on high. The man has never met a sentence he couldn't make sound like a constitutional amendment or a casual conversation he couldn't turn into a cross-examination. He's the kind of guy who probably reviews restaurant menus like they're motions for summary judgment and sends the waiter back for briefing when his steak isn't exactly medium rare. Around the Whitmore family orbit, I'm not Gavin Mercer, the guy who built a company from 3 lines of Python code in his Columbia Law School dorm room into a legal tech unicorn that processes more contracts in a day than most firms see in a year. I'm not the entrepreneur who identified a market inefficiency and built machine learning algorithms that can spot compliance issues faster than a team of first-year associates hopped up on Adderall in desperation. I'm certainly not the CEO who turned artificial intelligence into a legitimate tool for legal professionals who previously thought legal tech was an oxymoron like jumbo shrimp or military intelligence. No, around them, I'm the +1 with assets. I'm the guy who gets introduced at family functions with my net worth as my middle name. This is Gavin 42 million Mercer, they might as well say, husband to our Sloan. At dinner parties, I'm captioned with $signs instead of my actual accomplishments, like I'm a walking stock ticker instead of a human being who happened to solve a billion-dollar problem that the legal industry didn't even know it had. And you know what the really pathetic part is? I told myself it was fine. For months, I convinced myself that this was just the price of admission to their rarefied world, that being treated like a very expensive accessory was somehow worth it, because I got to be married to Sloan and accepted into the Whitmore family dynasty. I told myself that their casual dismissal of my achievements was just old money humor, that their inability to understand what I actually do for a living was charming in its antiquated ignorance. I told myself that when Harold introduced me to his golf buddies as Sloan's husband, the one with the computer company, it was affectionate rather than reductive. I convinced myself that when Sloan's mother asked me if I could fix her iPad at family gatherings, it was because she genuinely thought I was helpful, not because she literally couldn't distinguish between founder of a legal tech startup and guy who works at the Genius Bar. I rationalized every slight, every dismissive comment, every time someone asked me to explain what blockchain was, despite the fact that Lex Pilot has absolutely nothing to do with blockchain, or assumed that because I worked in tech, I must be some kind of antisocial weirdo who lived on energy drinks and had never seen sunlight. I smiled and nodded my way through countless conversations where venture capital was treated like a foreign concept and private equity was something that happened to other people's money. But here's the thing about self-deception. It has a half-life, and eventually, the bullshit decays enough that you can see through it. The breaking point wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some explosive confrontation or devastating betrayal. It was much worse than that. It was the slow, grinding realization that I had become complicit in my own diminishment. I had allowed myself to be reduced to a bank account with a pulse, a shareholder with feelings, a portfolio that occasionally needed to be fed and watered. The Whitmores didn't prefer my company to my presence. They preferred my money to my personality. They tolerated me because I was useful, the same way you tolerate a particularly efficient ATM. I was their personal venture capital fund, their in-house angel investor, their captive private equity sponsor who happened to sleep in their daughter's bed and occasionally showed up at family functions wearing expensive suits that proved I knew how to spend money, if not how to earn their respect. So I stopped pretending it was fine. Because it wasn't fine, and it never had been, and the only person who had been fooling themselves was me. And that's when I started planning my exit strategy. Because if there's one thing that building a successful startup teaches you, it's how to recognize when you're in a toxic situation that's never going to get better, no matter how much capital you throw at it. Sometimes the smartest move isn't to double down on a bad investment. It's to cut your losses and find a better deal. The Whitmores were about to learn that lesson the hard way. Welcome to the Whitmore dinner party circuit, where status anxiety masquerades as sophisticated conversation and everyone's portfolio performance is somehow always exceptional this quarter. These aren't your average dinner parties. They're performance art disguised as social gatherings, where Sloan's Circle recites their accomplishments like they're reading from prepared statements at shareholder meetings. The conversations follow a predictable script. Someone always has a board meeting story that sounds suspiciously like corporate fan fiction. Everyone owns at least one summer house that they refer to by its closest prestigious town rather than its actual address. And the Macallan 25 flows like it's subsidized by the Scottish government. I've sat through countless evenings watching grown adults compete over who has friends with a private jet, as if access to fractional aircraft ownership somehow validates their existence. These people treat private aviation like it's a personality trait rather than just another overpriced way to avoid TSA lines and airline food. The really pathetic part is watching them carefully drop these references into conversation like verbal breadcrumbs, hoping someone will follow the trail back to their perceived importance. The jokes at these gatherings are always light, which is rich person speak for cruel but delivered with expensive dental work and good breeding. I am perpetually the tech boy, as if I'm some kind of precocious child who stumbled into success by accident rather than a 34-year-old CEO who built his company through a combination of legal expertise, technical innovation, and enough caffeine to kill a small horse. Sometimes I get upgraded to the SaaS guy, which makes me sound like I sell software subscriptions door to door rather than running a company that processes billions of dollars in legal transactions annually. My personal favorite nickname is the shareholder with feelings, which Harold coined after I had the audacity to suggest that maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't use our Series B funding announcement as a conversation starter at his anniversary dinner. Apparently, caring about appropriate social boundaries makes me emotionally unstable in their worldview. God forbid I treat my company's financial milestones with anything resembling discretion or professionalism. The legal industry references at these dinners are particularly galling. These people treat contracts like they're cocktail napkins, decorative pieces of paper that exist to be scribbled on and then discarded. Harold once told a table full of guests that compliance is something for other people, which is rich coming from someone whose retirement fund depends on other people actually following the rules he used to interpret from the bench. The irony is lost on him, but then again, most things are lost on people who've never had to worry about the practical implications of their own decisions. Sloan is the worst part of all this. She calls Lex Pilot cute when we're in private, Like I've built an adorable little lemonade stand rather than a legal tech platform that's revolutionizing how major law firms handle document review and contract analysis. But watch her LinkedIn profile light up every time we close a major enterprise deal or get featured in legal tech news. Suddenly, my cute little company becomes a significant career asset worth posting about, complete with thoughtful commentary about innovation in the legal sector and hashtags about entrepreneurship and disruption. The cognitive dissonance is breathtaking. She'll spend dinner parties making jokes about my computer hobby, and then spend the next morning crafting LinkedIn posts about how proud she is to be married to a legal tech innovator who's transforming the industry through artificial intelligence and machine learning. She wants the social media credit without the social acceptance, the professional benefits without the personal respect. Her firm, Whitmore and Lyle LLP, uses our software, but of course they're on our lower-tier plan under what I can only describe as a sweetheart enterprise agreement that I approved to keep the peace. They get a discount that would make our CFO Priya on and weep actual tears if she knew the full extent of it. We're talking about a white shoe law firm with partners who bill $1,200 an hour getting access to cutting-edge legal technology for less than what most mid-sized firms pay. It's corporate charity disguised as family loyalty, and I've been enabling it for months because I thought it would somehow earn me points in their twisted scoring system. The truth is, the Whitmores prefer my money to my presence. They tolerate my company because my bank account throws off enough heat to warm their cold, judgmental hearts. But given the choice between having me at dinner or just having access to my assets, they'd pick the assets every single time. I'm like a particularly lucrative trust fund that happens to have opinions and feelings, useful for funding their lifestyle, but inconvenient when it comes to actual human interaction. I learned to smile and sign, which is probably the most pathetic admission I can make. I became a human autopen, mechanically approving their requests and financing their whims while they systematically dismantled my self-respect one dinner party at a time. I funded Harold's fishing trips to Alaska, underwrote Sloane's mother's charity galas, and quietly transferred money into family accounts whenever someone had a temporary cash flow situation that somehow never seemed to resolve itself. But here's where their arrogance finally worked in my favor. They got so comfortable treating me like a reliable ATM that they stopped paying attention to what I was actually doing with the rest of my portfolio. While they were busy making jokes about my tech hobby, I was quietly moving assets into a new family trust with guardrails that would make Fort Knox jealous. While they were patronizing me about my computer company, I was having my legal team audit every financial connection between my holdings and the Whitmore family orbit. I started treating our relationship like the business transaction it had always been, except now I was reading the fine print. Every shared account got scrutinized, every joint investment got reviewed, every casual financial favor got documented and categorized. I brought the same analytical approach to my personal life that I used to build LexPilot, systematic, thorough, and completely focused on identifying inefficiencies and potential vulnerabilities. The irony is delicious. They created their own worst nightmare by treating me like I was just a wallet with a pulse. They taught me that our relationship was transactional, that affection was conditional, and that respect had to be purchased rather than earned. They gave me a masterclass in emotional cost-benefit analysis, and now I was ready to graduate. What they didn't realize is that when you treat someone like a business partner rather than a family member, you give them permission to start thinking like a business partner. And business partners, unlike family members, have exit strategies. Nothing says family celebration quite like your wife asking you to sponsor her father's birthday party, as if Harold's 70th trip around the sun requires corporate underwriting rather than, actual family contribution. Sloane approached me about Harold's milestone birthday with the casual entitlement of someone who's never had to check her bank balance before making a purchase. She didn't ask if I wanted to help pay for the party. She asked me to sponsor it, which is corporate speak for pay for everything while getting none of the credit. The venue alone was going to run $48,000, which is more than most people make in a year, but in Whitmore world, that's apparently what constitutes intimate family gathering money. The location was some glass and brass monument to excess in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of place that charges by the square foot of marble and considers anything under 5 figures to be a casual weekday lunch budget. This wasn't a restaurant, or even a private club. This was a curated experience designed specifically for people who need their wealth to be visible from space. The kind of venue that has its own sommelier, its own florist, and probably its own therapist for guests who suffer anxiety attacks from being surrounded by so much ostentatious luxury. I paid the vendor through Arcadia Holdings LLC, one of my special purpose vehicles that I typically use for hospitality investments and real estate deals. It seemed cleaner that way, more businesslike, more professional, more like the corporate sponsorship arrangement that Sloane had explicitly requested rather than the family contribution she was pretending it was. Plus, running it through an LLC meant I had documentation, receipts, and a paper trail that would make my accountant happy and my lawyers even happier. For the occasion, I wore my best Tom Ford suit, charcoal gray, Italian wool, cut so precisely that it probably qualifies as architectural engineering. This wasn't just clothing. It was armor designed to survive the social battlefield I was about to enter. Sloane wore what I'd come to recognize as her courtroom smile, the one she reserves for hostile witnesses and opposing counsel. Except tonight, she was wearing it for her own husband. That should have been my first clue about how the evening was going to unfold. The Whitmores arrived at the party like they were making a grand entrance at their own press conference. Harold worked the room with the practiced efficiency of a politician running for re-election, shaking hands like he was still delivering verdicts from the bench and dispensing wisdom like he was getting paid by the platitude. His retirement clearly hadn't diminished his appetite for being the center of attention. If anything, it had concentrated it into a more potent form of judicial narcissism. Sloane's cousin Chandler was already 3 drinks deep and bragging about some sure thing acquisition his hedge fund was supposedly orchestrating. The way he described it, you'd think he was personally responsible for orchestrating the next great corporate merger rather than being a mid-level analyst who probably spends most of his time updating PowerPoint presentations and fetching coffee for actual decision-makers. But confidence is hereditary in the Whitmore family, along with an impressive ability to inflate minor professional responsibilities into world-changing achievements. Her sister Brielle had apparently appointed herself CFO of her boyfriend's startup, which was hilarious considering the boyfriend's startup was a social media app that helped people find the best brunch spots in their neighborhood. She kept talking about how they were waiting for the VC term sheet to hit, as if Sequoia Capital and Kleiner Perkins were in a bidding war over their revolutionary brunch location technology. The delusion was almost admirable in its scope and ambition. I found myself gravitating toward the bar, where I poured myself a generous glass of Macallan 25-year-old single malt, the good stuff that costs more per ounce than most people spend on groceries in a week. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was drinking whiskey that cost more than many people's rent while surrounded by people who thought my life's work was adorable. I positioned myself by the floor-to-ceiling windows, ostensibly admiring the Manhattan skyline, but actually counting fire escapes like I was planning my own emergency exit strategy. The view from up there was spectacular. Central Park stretched out like an expensive green carpet, and the city lights twinkled below us like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. It was the kind of view that real estate agents describe as priceless and charge accordingly, the kind of perspective that's supposed to make you feel successful and accomplished and grateful for your good fortune. Instead, I felt like I was trapped in a very expensive terrarium, on display for people who found me interesting primarily because of my net worth. The glass walls that were supposed to showcase the city's beauty felt more like barriers keeping me contained, keeping me visible but separate from the world I'd actually built outside this rarefied bubble of inherited privilege and casual cruelty. From my position by the window, I had a perfect view of the party's social dynamics. Harold was holding court near the appetizer station, surrounded by retired judges and current partners from various white shoe law firms, all of them nodding sagely as he dispensed legal war stories and judicial wisdom. Sloane was networking with precision, working the room like she was campaigning for something, making sure to hit every important conversation cluster with just the right amount of charm and professional insight. The venue manager kept checking his tablet and nodding approvingly. Everything was running on schedule, the catering was flawless, the service was invisible but impeccable. This was the kind of event that would be referenced for months afterward, the kind of party that becomes part of family lore and social media legend. The $48,000 I'd spent through Arcadia Holdings was buying more than just an evening. It was purchasing a memory, a story, a status marker that would echo through the Whitmore family narrative for years to come. What none of them realized was that I wasn't just observing the party, I was studying it. Every conversation, every casual reference to family business, every offhand comment about assets and investments was being cataloged and analyzed. I was treating this like market research, gathering intelligence about the people who had spent months treating me like a very expensive pet. The Macallan was smooth and smoky, with notes of leather and oak that reminded me of old law libraries and serious conversations. It was the kind of whiskey that demanded respect, that rewarded patience and attention. Unlike the company I was keeping. You know that moment in every corporate restructuring when someone finally says the quiet part out loud? When all the polite euphemisms and careful diplomatic language get stripped away, and you're left staring at the brutal truth in Times New Roman font. That's what happened when I walked past the entrance table and saw the name tags. The setup was elegant, as you'd expect from a $48,000 venue. Crisp, white linen tablecloth, probably Egyptian cotton or some other thread count status symbol. Little crystal bowls filled with mints that nobody would eat, but everyone would admire. And there, arranged in neat rows like a corporate org chart made flesh, were the evening's name tags. Each one a carefully crafted piece of family branding designed to remind everyone exactly where they stood in the Whitmore hierarchy. Harold, the judge, was positioned at the head of the table, naturally, because even in retirement, Harold couldn't resist the gravitational pull of judicial authority. The parenthetical wasn't just descriptive. It was a title, a brand, a reminder that this man had spent decades making decisions that other people had to live with. In Harold's world, being called judge isn't just professional courtesy, it's a lifestyle choice. Sloane, the star, made me pause and read it twice. The star, not the lawyer, or the associate, or even the daughter, the star. Because apparently, in the Whitmore family constellation, Sloane isn't just another litigation associate grinding through billable hours and client development requirements. She's the designated future of the family dynasty, the chosen one who'll carry the Whitmore legacy into the next generation of white shoe legal excellence. Chandler, the closer, was peak Whitmore delusion, taking a mid-level hedge fund analyst who probably spends most of his time updating Excel models and rebranding him as some kind of deal-making rainmaker. The closer. Right. I'd seen Chandler's LinkedIn profile. His biggest professional accomplishment was completing the CFA program on his third attempt. But sure, let's pretend he's out there closing billion-dollar acquisitions instead of closing the gap between his ambitions and his actual skill set. There were others, each more carefully curated than the last. Uncles and cousins and family friends, all tagged with their respective roles in the Whitmore mythology. The philanthropist, the entrepreneur, the visionary, titles that sounded like they'd been focus grouped by a PR firm specializing in dynasty management. And then I found mine. Gavin, the disappointment. In bold, like they wanted to make sure it was legible from across the room, in case anyone missed the message. Not the founder, or the CEO, or even the tech guy. The disappointment. Apparently, building a legal tech unicorn from nothing, closing a Series B funding round that most entrepreneurs can only dream of, and creating artificial intelligence solutions that are revolutionizing how law firms handle contract analysis wasn't impressive enough to merit a flattering parenthetical. The laughter started immediately. Not shocked laughter. Not the kind of surprised, uncomfortable reaction you'd expect when someone crosses a line at a family gathering. This was familiar laughter, the kind that comes from shared understanding, from an inside joke that everyone's been enjoying for months. This was the sound of people who had been calling me the disappointment, in private finally getting to see it in writing. Sloane appeared at my elbow, champagne flute in hand, looking like she'd just watched a particularly satisfying cross-examination. She sipped her Dom Perignon. Because of course it was Dom Perignon, because why serve regular champagne when you can serve champagne that costs more than most people's car payments? And delivered the kill shot with practiced efficiency. Well, she said, examining the name tag like it was an exhibit in a trial she was winning, it's true. Not, it's a joke, or someone's being inappropriate, or this is unacceptable. Just, it's true. delivered with the casual finality of someone reading a parking sign or announcing the weather. Like my status as a disappointment was simply a fact of nature, as immutable as gravity or compound interest or the tendency of old money families to eat their own young. The people around us glanced in my direction with the peculiar expression you reserve for art you're not sure you're allowed to touch. There was curiosity there, but also a kind of anthropological fascination, like they were observing some exotic species in its natural habitat. Look, children, there's the disappointment in the wild. Notice how it wears expensive suits and makes polite conversation despite being systematically humiliated by its natural predators. My first instinct was to leave. Just walk away, call my driver, go home to my penthouse, and pretend this evening had never happened. Cut my losses, write off the $48,000 as a learning experience, and start the divorce proceedings in the morning. It would have been clean, professional, and completely unsatisfying. My second instinct was older and colder, and it whispered something much more interesting in my ear. It reminded me that the best revenge isn't walking away from the table. It's flipping the table over and making everyone else clean up the mess. I set the name tag down carefully, making sure it was perfectly centered on the pristine linen. I wanted the placement to be deliberate, intentional, like I was signing a contract or filing a motion with the court. This wasn't anger or hurt feelings or wounded pride. This was something much more dangerous, clarity. The room tilted in my favor the moment I smiled. Not a hurt smile or a bitter smile or even a sarcastic smile. This was the smile I wore during board meetings when someone challenged our valuation model and I knew I had the data to prove them wrong. This was the smile I wore when competitors tried to poach our clients, and I knew our technology was 3 generations ahead of anything they could offer. This was the smile of someone who had just realized that the game everyone thought they were winning was actually a completely different game, with completely different rules, and I was the only one who knew how to play it. The Whitmores had spent months training me to think of myself as a disappointment. They'd systematically dismantled my confidence, dismissed my achievements, and reduced my identity to a simple financial transaction. They'd turned me into their personal ATM and then mocked me for being mechanical and emotionally distant. But here's what they forgot. I wasn't just their disappointment. I was their disappointment with a Series B funding round, extensive legal training, and a very sophisticated understanding of corporate governance. I was their disappointment with connections throughout the private equity world and enough liquidity to make their comfortable little lives very uncomfortable. The name tag was still sitting there, perfectly centered, when I decided to give them exactly what they'd asked for. Sometimes the most valuable intelligence comes from people who think they're just making small talk. I walked the floor like I was conducting due diligence on a potential acquisition target, which, in a way, I was. Every conversation became market research, every casual comment a data point in my growing understanding of exactly how vulnerable the Whitmore financial ecosystem actually was. These people had gotten so comfortable with their inherited privilege that they'd forgotten the first rule of wealth preservation. Never let anyone know exactly how much you have, or more importantly, how you got it. Near the champagne fountain, because of course there was a champagne fountain, because why have regular champagne service when you can have champagne that flows like a small waterfall of liquid bankruptcy? I struck up a conversation with David Kellerman, the CFO of Harold's Charitable Foundation. David was 3 drinks past professional discretion and apparently eager to share his creative approach to nonprofit financial management. The trick, he confided, leaning in with the conspiratorial air of someone revealing state secrets, is understanding that foundations have more flexibility than people realize. Creative accounting isn't illegal if you know how to structure the transactions properly. We've been moving assets between the foundation and Harold's personal holding company for years. Perfectly legal, just creative. Creative accounting. Right. That's what they call it when you use a non-profit organization as your personal piggy bank, shuffling assets back and forth like you're playing 3-card monte with the IRS. I nodded and smiled and made appropriate interested noises while mentally cataloging every detail for future reference. David kept talking, apparently under the impression that I was impressed rather than appalled. Over by the raw bar, I found myself in conversation with Marcus Whitmore, one of Harold's partners from the firm's glory days. Marcus had clearly enjoyed several glasses of the Macallan and was feeling philosophical about the legal profession's relationship with regulatory oversight. "You know what I love about being retired?" Marcus asked, not waiting for an answer. "No more compliance bullshit. No more ethics committees breathing down your neck. No more worried junior associates asking if we're following proper procedures. Contracts are suggestions, kid. Always have been. The law is whatever you can convince a judge to believe, and everything else is just paperwork. Contracts are suggestions." That's a fascinating legal philosophy from someone who spent 40 years billing clients thousands of dollars an hour to draft those same suggestions. I filed that gem away next to David's creative accounting seminar and kept circulating. The venue manager appeared at my elbow, tablet in hand, and wearing the kind of grateful expression that suggested he recognized a reliable revenue stream when he saw one. "Mr. Mercer," he said, consulting his screen, "I wanted to personally thank Arcadia Holdings for being such a steady shareholder in our parent company. Your investment group has been instrumental in helping us maintain our position in the luxury hospitality market." Steady shareholder. That was interesting. I'd invested in the venue's parent company about 18 months ago through one of my hospitality-focused LLCs, but I hadn't realized how significant that stake had become until the venue manager started treating me like his personal patron saint. It's amazing how much more forthcoming people become when they realize you're not just a customer, you're an owner. "Always happy to support quality hospitality ventures," I replied, which was true enough. What I didn't mention was that my support came with certain governance rights that the venue manager probably wasn't fully aware of. Board seats, financial reporting requirements, the ability to call special shareholder meetings. All very boring corporate machinery that most people ignore until someone decides to use it. Near the dessert station, Sloane's friends were having the kind of conversation that makes legal ethics professors wake up in cold sweats. They were discussing their recent cases with the casual indifference of people who've never had to worry about professional consequences, dropping client names and case details like they were discussing weekend plans rather than confidential attorney-client communications. "The funny thing about compliance requirements," laughed Jennifer Hartwell, a junior partner at some boutique litigation shop, "is that they assume clients actually read the engagement letters. Half our retainer agreements could include a clause requiring clients to sacrifice their firstborn to the litigation gods, and they'd still sign without reading." That got a good laugh from the group. Everyone seemed to think that professional responsibility rules were more like professional responsibility suggestions, guidelines for people who lacked the sophistication to understand when rules didn't really apply to them. It was breathtaking in its casual arrogance and absolutely invaluable from an intelligence-gathering perspective. "Speaking of engagement letters," chimed in Sarah Chan, an in-house counsel for some mid-sized investment firm, "my CEO keeps asking if your AI can write our motions for us. I keep telling him that artificial intelligence can't fix bad facts, but he seems to think technology is magic." They all turned to look at me expectantly, waiting for some kind of tech bro wisdom about how machine learning was going to revolutionize the practice of law. Instead, I gave them exactly what they expected, a politely self-deprecating response about the limitations of current AI technology and the irreplaceable value of human legal judgment. What I didn't tell them was that Lex Pilot's newest version could absolutely identify the kind of sloppy legal work they were describing, and that our compliance monitoring features were specifically designed to catch the kind of casual rule-bending they'd been joking about all evening. As the evening progressed, I found myself thinking about the last 18 months of my life with the kind of analytical clarity that comes from finally having enough information to make informed decisions. The pieces of a much larger puzzle were clicking into place, and what I was seeing was both more complex and more vulnerable than I'd initially realized. The distressed debt stack I'd quietly purchased on Whitmore Capital Properties, Harold's commercial real estate holding company, at a significant discount 18 months ago, wasn't just a good investment opportunity. It was leverage. The debt-to-equity conversion I'd negotiated through a clean restructuring process wasn't just smart financial planning. It was positioning. The consents I'd obtained from various small cousins who wanted liquidity for their inherited stakes weren't just routine corporate governance. They were votes. And my growing relationship with Hemisphere Equity, the mid-market private equity firm that specialized in exactly the kind of messy family dynasty situations that the Whitmores represented, that wasn't just portfolio diversification. That was strategic partnership. The pieces were already on the board. All I needed was the right moment to make my move. And thanks to tonight's festivities, I finally understood exactly what that moment was going to look like. There's something beautifully ironic about using a champagne flute to deliver a hostile takeover announcement. I walked back to the bar and picked up a fresh glass of Dom Perignon, holding it up to catch the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. The champagne was perfect, tiny bubbles rising in perfect formation, like little missiles of expensive indifference. I lifted my Columbia Law School class ring, the one piece of jewelry I never took off, my reminder that I'd earned my place in their world through merit rather than inheritance, and tapped it gently against the crystal. The sound cut through the party chatter with surgical precision, not loud enough to be rude, but clear enough to command attention from everyone in the room. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. The Whitmore family social machinery ground to a halt as everyone waited to see what the disappointment had to say. To Harold, I began, my voice carrying easily across the room with the kind of courtroom projection they teach you in trial advocacy class, who taught me that appearances are not the same as agreements, and that loyalty without mutual consideration is just an unwritten contract no sane person should sign. A few scattered laughs rippled through the crowd, the nervous kind of laughter that happens when people aren't quite sure if they're witnessing humor or homicide. Harold's eyes narrowed slightly, but he maintained his judicial composure, probably assuming this was just another case of his son-in-law trying too hard to fit in with lawyer humor. Sloane rolled her wrist in that dismissive gesture she'd perfected during law school moot court competitions, the one that said, "How pedestrian," without requiring actual words. The beautiful thing about being underestimated is that people stop paying attention to the substance of what you're saying because they're so focused on dismissing the messenger. Harold was probably running my words through his internal legal analysis engine, looking for the kind of obvious rhetorical weaknesses that would allow him to deliver a devastating comeback. Sloane was likely calculating how much social damage control she'd need to do after her husband finished embarrassing himself in front of her family's professional network. What neither of them realized was that I wasn't making small talk. I was delivering a closing argument. And to my wife, I continued, raising the glass higher and letting my voice carry just a hint of the ice that had been accumulating in my chest for months. Who believes I'm a disappointment? The laughter died completely. The room got quiet in that particular way that happens when a social gathering suddenly realizes it's about to witness something that can't be taken back. I could feel the collective intake of breath, the social media sensors going off in people's heads as they started calculating whether they were about to see something worth recording or something they'd rather forget. Sloane's face shifted from dismissive amusement to something approaching concern, but she was still operating under the assumption that this was just wounded pride talking, that her disappointment of a husband was finally having the emotional breakdown she'd been expecting for months. Harold maintained his judicial poker face, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was starting to recognize that this might not be the kind of toast he'd been anticipating. "Tonight, I agree," I said, and watched Sloane's expression shift from concern to confusion to something that might have been the first stirring of actual fear, with one edit. The pause was everything. In that silence, I could feel the room's energy changing, the social dynamic shifting from polite attention to genuine curiosity. These people were used to family drama. Every wealthy family has its share of public meltdowns and private scandals. But there was something about my tone that suggested this wasn't going to be your typical rich person temper tantrum. "I'm a disappointment to your expectations," I clarified, letting each word land with the precision of a well-drafted contract clause, not to my obligations. Now Harold's poker face was slipping. He was a retired appellate judge, which meant he'd spent decades listening to lawyers make arguments, and his judicial instincts were finally picking up on the fact that this wasn't an emotional outburst. This was a prepared statement. This was advocacy. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had thought through every possible response and counterargument. Sloane had gone completely still, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. The social machinery that normally governed her responses had short-circuited because she couldn't categorize what was happening. Was this a fight? Was this a breakdown? Was this some kind of elaborate joke that she wasn't getting? Her litigation training was screaming at her that something was very wrong, but her personal experience with me, months of treating me like a reliable ATM with personality disorders, had convinced her that I wasn't capable of this kind of strategic thinking. "So here's my last gift," I said, raising the champagne flute until it caught the light like a beacon, a clean exit. The venue manager had stopped pretending to check his tablet. The catering staff had abandoned all pretense of being invisible and were openly staring. Even the background music seemed to have gotten quieter, as if the sound system itself was leaning in to hear what came next. "To the last time you'll ever see me." I held the glass there for another beat, letting the words settle into the room like sediment in expensive wine. The silence was perfect, not uncomfortable, not awkward, just complete. It was the kind of silence that happens in boardrooms when someone announces a merger, or in courtrooms when a verdict gets read, or in any situation where everyone suddenly realizes that the world has just changed in some fundamental way. Harold's face had gone through several color changes, settling on something between judicial outrage and genuine shock. Sloane looked like she'd been slapped with a brief she hadn't expected. The rest of the family was performing various stages of social processing, some still trying to figure out if this was supposed to be funny, others beginning to understand that they'd just witnessed something that was going to require extensive post-party analysis and damage control. I set my champagne glass down on the nearest surface with the kind of gentle precision that corporate raiders use when they're placing hostile takeover bids on conference tables. Not dramatic, not angry, just final. Then I smiled the way litigators do when they already have the exhibits that prove their case, turned toward the exit, and started walking away from the last $48,000 I would ever spend on these people. The gift table was positioned strategically near the exit, a crystal-laden shrine to Harold's accumulated decades of judicial wisdom and family patriarch status. Expensive crystal bowls overflowing with congratulatory cards from legal luminaries, wrapped boxes that probably contain the kind of luxury items you give to someone who already owns everything, and elaborate floral arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Into this monument to wealth and tradition, I placed a single plain white envelope. No ribbon, no bow, no expensive wrapping paper, just clean white bond paper with Justice Harold Whitmore written across the front in my precise handwriting. The kind of envelope that attorneys use for formal legal correspondence, the kind that immediately signals that whatever's inside isn't a birthday greeting or family sentiment. Inside were 4 documents and a key card, each one representing months of careful planning and legal preparation that the Whitmores had been too busy patronizing me to notice. While they were making jokes about my tech hobby and treating me like their personal venture capital fund, I'd been conducting what amounted to a forensic audit of their entire financial ecosystem. While they were calling me the disappointment, I'd been systematically acquiring leverage over every asset they thought they controlled. The first document was a unanimous written consent of the majority shareholders for Whitmore Capital Properties, LLC, Harold's commercial real estate holding company and the cornerstone of the family's generational wealth. Effective at 12:01 a.m. the following day, the board of directors would be completely reconstituted under the terms of the operating agreement that Harold himself had drafted 3 years earlier. My special purpose vehicle, Arcadia Holdings, along with our strategic partner Hemisphere Equity, would be appointing 2 new directors to a 3-person board, giving us effective control over every major business decision. The beauty of it was that everything was completely legal. More than legal, it was elegant. When I'd quietly purchased the distressed debt stack on Whitmore Capital Properties 18 months ago, I hadn't just bought debt. I'd bought conversion rights, board appointment rights, and voting control triggers that would activate the moment certain financial covenants were breached. Harold had signed off on the debt restructuring personally, probably assuming that his son-in-law was just making a smart investment play rather than engineering a perfectly legal corporate coup. The second document was a notice of assignment and acceleration regarding the senior debt on the Whitmore family's crown jewel, their Midtown office tower that housed Whitmore and Lyle LLP and generated the rental income that funded Harold's comfortable retirement lifestyle. That debt, which had been quietly sold and transferred through a series of perfectly routine commercial transactions, was now owned by Arcadia Holdings. And due to several technical covenant breaches that Harold's creative accounting had inadvertently triggered, the entire principal balance was now immediately due and payable. The acceleration clause was a thing of beauty. It had been sitting there in the original loan documents like a loaded gun that nobody expected would ever be fired. But when you combine creative foundation accounting with charitable trust distributions that didn't quite follow IRS guidelines, you create exactly the kind of material adverse changes in creditworthiness that sophisticated lenders build into their loan agreements as protection against borrower stupidity. The third document was perhaps my personal favorite, a vendor termination and license non-renewal notice for LexPilot's enterprise agreement with Whitmore and Lyle LLP. After months of providing cutting-edge legal technology at below-market rates as a family courtesy, we were terminating their sweetheart deal due to repeated compliance failures and unpaid overages that had been accumulating in their account, like interest on a credit card they'd forgotten they owned. The compliance failures were real and well-documented. Harold's firm had been using our contract analysis tools to review documents for clients without maintaining proper data security protocols, violating both our terms of service and several professional responsibility rules that govern how law firms handle confidential client information. They could stay on our platform if they wanted, but they'd be paying rack rates like everyone else, and they'd need to complete our full compliance certification process before we'd restore their access to the premium features that had been making their associates look competent. The fourth document was the one I'd been looking forward to drafting for months, a separation agreement and prenuptial agreement enforcement notice addressed to my dear wife Sloan. Every credit card would be canceled by close of business. The Tesla would be returned to the leasing company that technically owned it. Her access to the Upper West Side penthouse would be revoked by Monday morning, along with her keys to the Hamptons house and her authorization to use the private banking services that had been making her lifestyle possible. No alimony. The prenuptial agreement we'd signed 3 years ago was ironclad, drafted by the best matrimonial attorneys that Harold's referral network could provide. The same legal thoroughness that had been designed to protect the Whitmore family assets in case of divorce was now protecting my assets from the Whitmore family. The fair asset schedule attached to the separation agreement laid out exactly what Sloan would be walking away with. Her personal belongings, her law school debt, and her salary from a job that was about to become significantly more difficult without access to the legal technology that had been subsidizing her productivity. The key card was the final touch, building access credentials for the new property management company that would be taking over the Whitmore office tower once the debt acceleration was complete. The Whitmores would receive 48 hours notice before the locks were changed, which was more courtesy than required under the loan documents, but exactly the kind of professional consideration that would make the transition seem businesslike rather than personal. Every document was time-stamped by our corporate legal team, notarized by a licensed notary public, and prepared in accordance with New York State commercial law and federal securities regulations. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is emotional and sloppy and vulnerable to legal challenge. This was corporate governance, executed with the same precision and attention to detail that had built LexPilot into a legal tech unicorn. I left the envelope next to the monogrammed cake knife, positioned so that Harold would see it immediately when he went to cut his birthday cake. The symbolism wasn't accidental. While he was celebrating another year of his comfortable, entitled existence, he'd be simultaneously discovering that the legal and financial foundation of that existence had just shifted beneath his feet, like continental drift compressed into a single evening. The envelope sat there like a white flag of surrender, except I was the one who had been surrendering for months, and now it was their turn. The Manhattan air hit my face like a cleansing breath of freedom as I stepped out of that glass and brass monument to inherited privilege. For the first time in months, I felt like I could actually breathe without someone monitoring my oxygen consumption for billing purposes. I pulled out my phone and speed-dialed Priya Anand, my CFO, and the most ruthlessly efficient financial professional I've ever had the privilege of working with. Priya had been expecting this call. We'd spent weeks preparing for what we diplomatically referred to as Operation Clean Break in our planning sessions. She answered on the first ring, which meant she was already at her computer with our predetermined playbook loaded and ready for execution. Go, I said, which was the only authorization she needed to unleash 18 months of careful corporate planning. Within minutes, Priya was running the most comprehensive financial separation protocol that our general counsel had ever drafted. Vendor termination notices were being sent via certified mail and secure email to every service provider that had any connection to Whitmore family accounts. Corporate credit cards that I'd foolishly allowed Sloan to use for business entertainment were being canceled faster than a startup burning through series of funding. Shared bank account authorizations were being revoked with the kind of surgical precision that would make a hostile takeover specialist weep with joy. The family discount pipelines that had been quietly subsidizing the Whitmore lifestyle. Everything from the discounted LexPilot enterprise license to the preferential rates I'd negotiated for their legal research databases were being severed with extreme prejudice. Every financial connection between my carefully built business empire and their trust fund ecosystem was being cauterized like a surgical wound that needed to heal cleanly. My phone started buzzing with automated alerts that told the story of a financial empire being systematically dismantled in real time. Board confirmation emails from Whitmore Capital Properties, where our predetermined shareholder consent was now officially filed and recorded. Wire transfer receipts showing the debt acceleration proceeds being moved into escrow accounts managed by our corporate attorneys. Calendar invitations for an 8 a.m. board meeting at Whitmore Capital Properties, where Hemisphere equity partner Lucas Grant and I would be formally taking control of Harold's commercial real estate empire. Change of control notification emails were flooding in from every investment vehicle that had any connection to Whitmore family interests. The access log for the Upper West Side building showed that Sloan's key fob had been deactivated at exactly 11:47 p.m., which meant she'd discover her lockout status the moment she tried to swipe into the building that had been her home for the past 3 years. I slid into my Tesla Model S Plaid, the one piece of automotive excellence that would be staying with me, since I'd been smart enough to lease it through one of my holding companies rather than letting it become part of our joint marital assets. The dashboard screen lit up immediately, displaying my face in its dark reflection like a witness to my own transformation. The car had been programmed to recognize my biometric data, which meant it would never accidentally grant access to anyone else, regardless of their previous relationship to the vehicle's primary user. The drive back to my penthouse gave me 23 minutes to process what I'd just accomplished and prepare for the inevitable fallout. 23 minutes of Manhattan traffic and classical music to transform myself from disappointed family member to corporate predator. 23 minutes to shed the last vestiges of the person who had been willing to tolerate systematic humiliation in exchange for social acceptance from people who would never actually accept him. Meanwhile, back in that $48,000 venue, the white envelope was being discovered exactly as I'd planned. I could picture the scene. Harold approaching the gift table with the satisfied smile of someone who expected to spend the next hour graciously accepting tribute from his assembled professional network. The monogrammed cake knife gleaming under the crystal chandelier. The moment of confusion when he noticed the plain white envelope positioned next to the congratulatory cards and expensive gift boxes. The venue manager would be checking the signature line on our venue contract right about now, realizing that his steady shareholder had just executed a perfectly legal change of control that would fundamentally alter the power dynamic in his establishment. Arcadia Holdings wasn't just a customer anymore. We were a controlling investor with governance rights and board representation and the ability to make decisions about everything from catering contracts to facility management. Inside the ballroom, Sloan's laughter was dying a slow, horrible death as she processed the separation agreement and realized that her comfortable lifestyle was about to become significantly less comfortable. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed 3 years ago, the one her father's attorneys had drafted to protect the Whitmore family assets, was now protecting my assets from the Whitmore family. The irony was so perfect it could have been written by a screenwriter who specialized in corporate comeuppance stories. Harold's judicial composure was probably cracking like old legal precedent as he read through the unanimous written consent and realized that his commercial real estate empire was now controlled by the same son-in-law he'd been calling the disappointment for months. The debt acceleration notice would be hitting him like a motion for summary judgment that he couldn't oppose, couldn't appeal, and couldn't negotiate away. Chandler was probably stopping mid-sentence in whatever acquisition fantasy he'd been spinning, finally understanding that his family's financial foundation had just shifted beneath his feet like quicksand disguised as bedrock. Brielle's startup CFO ambitions were about to collide with the reality that her family's venture capital connections had just been severed along with everything else. The compliance failures at Whitmore and Lyle were about to become very expensive very quickly. Without their discounted access to LexPilot's contract analysis tools, their associates would be back to manual document review and traditional due diligence processes that would triple their research time and quadruple their error rates. Their competitive advantage in the legal marketplace, the advantage that had been subsidized by my technology and my goodwill, was evaporating faster than startup equity in a bear market. My phone buzzed with a text from Priya. All systems green. Corporate separation complete. Tomorrow's board meeting confirmed for 8 a.m. Legal counsel standing by for anticipated pushback. Welcome to your new life, boss. Welcome to my new life indeed. A life where I wouldn't be anyone's disappointment, anyone's ATM, or anyone's +1 with assets. Just Gavin Mercer, founder and CEO, with a clean balance sheet and a completely restructured family situation. I woke up at 6 a.m. to the sound of my phone buzzing like an angry hornet trapped in a corporate law textbook. 17 missed calls, 43 unread texts, and enough email notifications to crash a server. The Whitmore legal machine had apparently spent the night trying to figure out how to reverse engineer a perfectly executed corporate restructuring. And based on the increasingly desperate tone of their communications, they were discovering that good legal work is very difficult to undo. By the time I'd finished my first cup of coffee, single-origin Ethiopian beans that cost more per pound than most law school textbooks, Whitmore and Lyle LLP had already sent 4 different emails with variations on the theme of "We reserve all rights." Each message was more legally verbose than the last, as if they thought they could intimidate me through sheer volume of legalese. The final email was a masterpiece of law firm bluster, complete with citations to cases that had nothing to do with our situation and threats of legal action that would have been impressive if they weren't so obviously desperate. I replied exactly once. So do I. 2 words. No legal citations, no detailed explanations, no elaborate justifications for my actions. Just a simple acknowledgement that I also reserved all rights, including the rights I'd already exercised, the rights I was continuing to exercise, and the rights I plan to exercise in the future. In corporate communications, sometimes the most powerful response is the one that doesn't waste time explaining itself to people who should already understand the situation. The compliance team at Whitmore and Lyle was apparently having some kind of professional crisis because they requested an emergency meeting to discuss their temporary access issues with LexPilot's platform. I politely declined their request for a free consultation and offered my services as an hourly consultant at our standard market rates. $750 per hour for technical consulting, $1,200 per hour if they wanted legal advice about compliance matters, and $2,000 per hour if they expected me to fix problems that they'd created through their own professional negligence. The beauty of transitioning from family member to service provider is that you get to charge for your time instead of donating it. Amazing how quickly people's attitudes change when your expertise costs them money instead of just their dignity. Sloane's text messages were a fascinating psychological case study in the 5 stages of divorce grief, compressed into digital format and delivered with the manic energy of someone whose comfortable world had just collapsed overnight. The first wave was pure anger. "You're fucking insane if you think you can get away with this. My father will destroy you. This is illegal, and you know it." Classic denial rage, the kind of response you get from people who are used to getting their way through volume and intimidation. The second wave tried strategic negotiation. "We need to talk about this like adults. There has to be a way to work this out. I'm willing to discuss reasonable compromises." This was Sloane's litigation training kicking in, the part of her legal education that taught her to look for settlement opportunities even in apparently hopeless situations. The third wave was pure emotional manipulation. "You're destroying our family. This will hurt everyone, including you. Is this really what you want our marriage to be remembered for?" The appeals to guilt and sentiment that work on people who still have emotional investment in the relationship, but fall flat when directed at someone who's already processed their feelings and moved on to financial planning. I forwarded all of her communications to Ray Okafor, my personal counsel, along with a gentle reminder about the non-disclosure clauses in our separation agreement. Ray would handle the formal responses with the kind of professional courtesy that makes it clear you're being managed by attorneys rather than engaged in personal conversation. Sometimes the most devastating message you can send someone is that they're no longer worth your direct attention. Harold called from an unknown number around 9:30 a.m., probably using one of the prepaid phones that paranoid people buy when they're trying to avoid creating electronic evidence of their conversations. His voice had lost all of its judicial authority and taken on the slightly desperate edge of someone who was finally beginning to understand the scope of his situation. "This is a hostile takeover," he said, which was technically accurate, but also completely missing the point. "No, Judge," I replied, enjoying the irony of having to explain basic corporate law to a retired appellate judge. "This is governance. Hostile takeovers happen to companies that resist acquisition. Governance happens to shareholders who've been outvoted by people who own more equity than they do." Harold wanted a week to explore options, which was legal speak for hire expensive attorneys to figure out if there's any way to reverse this. I gave him exactly 1 day, which was more generous than required under the terms of our various agreements, but exactly the kind of professional courtesy that would look good in any future litigation. At 8 a.m. sharp, we convened in the Whitmore Capital Properties conference room that I now effectively controlled. Lucas Grant from Hemisphere Equity attended via secure video conference, looking like the kind of private equity professional who treats billion-dollar acquisitions like casual Tuesday morning meetings. My attorney Ray Okafor was physically present, dressed in the kind of understated but expensive suit that signals serious legal firepower without being ostentatious about it. Harold brought two shell-shocked uncles who looked like they'd been dragged out of retirement to deal with a corporate crisis they didn't understand. These were the kind of family shareholders who'd inherited their stakes decades ago and assumed that board meetings were just formalities where they showed up, nodded politely, and collected their quarterly distributions without asking difficult questions about governance or fiduciary duties. We voted. Every motion carried with mathematical precision. The restructuring plan I'd been developing for 18 months was now formally approved, and implementation would begin immediately. Harold's commercial real estate empire was now controlled by a board that prioritized professional management over family sentiment, and every major business decision would be made according to actual corporate governance principles rather than whatever Harold felt like doing that particular week. I wasn't cruel during the meeting. Cruelty is unprofessional and creates unnecessary legal exposure. I was formal, which is what people call you when you stop asking for permission and start citing the specific paragraphs in the operating agreement that give you the authority to make unilateral decisions. Harold kept looking for openings to negotiate or delay or somehow restore the comfortable family dynamic where everyone deferred to his judgment regardless of their actual legal rights. But corporate governance isn't a family dinner conversation. It's a legal framework designed to protect shareholders from exactly the kind of casual financial management that Harold had been practicing for years. 6 months later, I moved into a quiet Soho loft that felt more like home after 1 week than the Upper West Side penthouse had after 3 years of marriage. The space was clean, modern, and entirely free of inherited baggage or family photos that required diplomatic explanations to house guests. I kept the penthouse on the market because prime Manhattan real estate is always a solid investment, and watching potential buyers walk through the space that used to represent my gilded cage gave me the kind of satisfaction that money can't buy, but good legal planning can definitely arrange. I kept paying my team well, better than well, actually. Lex Pilot's employee compensation packages had always been competitive, but after my corporate restructuring experience, I gained a renewed appreciation for the kind of loyalty that comes from treating talented people like the valuable assets they actually are rather than the expensive liabilities that most companies pretend they are. Priya Anand got an equity bump that reflected her surgical execution during Operation Clean Break. Our engineering team got bonuses that recognized their role in building technology that was now processing more legal transactions than half the major law firms in Manhattan. The company itself was thriving in ways that I'd hardly dared to imagine during those suffocating months of Whitmore family dinners. Lex Pilot shipped a new machine learning feature that could identify compliance issues in complex merger agreements faster than teams of associates armed with Red Bull and professional anxiety. Our Series B investors were practically euphoric about our user traction and retention metrics, which had improved dramatically once I'd stopped treating the company like a hobby that existed to impress my in-laws and started treating it like the legal tech unicorn it had always been capable of becoming. We onboard 2 new enterprise clients that happened to compete directly with Whitmore and Lyle LLP in the commercial litigation space. Pure coincidence, of course. These firms had approached us independently after seeing our compliance monitoring capabilities and contract analysis tools in action. The fact that they could now offer their clients more sophisticated legal technology than Harold's legacy firm was just the natural result of market forces and technological innovation. Business isn't revenge, but it does rhyme with poetic justice, and sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about corporate karma. People ask me if I miss the parties, which is like asking someone who's escaped from prison if they miss the exercise yard. I don't miss rehearsed love or pre-printed social labels. I don't miss conversations where my net worth was more interesting than my actual accomplishments, or family gatherings where I needed to check my bank balance before expressing an opinion. I don't miss being introduced as the plus one with assets, or being treated like a very expensive pet who occasionally needed to be fed and watered and allowed to make important decisions about funding other people's lifestyle choices. What I discovered is that I like boardrooms where shareholders actually read the documents before signing them and understand that fiduciary duties aren't just theoretical concepts that apply to other people's money. I like family gatherings where people are related by choice rather than accident, and where affection doesn't require a minimum net worth to unlock basic human respect. I like dinner parties where the conversation is about ideas rather than asset portfolios, and where nobody needs to name-drop their private jet access to feel relevant. When Sloane's attorney tried one final push for what they diplomatically called temporary lifestyle support, the prenuptial contract governed the outcome with the same mathematical precision that had governed every other aspect of our separation. The court nodded approvingly at the thorough documentation, the proper legal procedures, and the complete absence of any emotional manipulation or financial gamesmanship. Harold's own attorneys had drafted an agreement so ironclad that their attempts to break it only served to highlight their original legal craftsmanship. Sometimes the best revenge is letting people be defeated by their own competence. The Whitmore and Lyle LLP compliance situation had resolved itself in exactly the way that market forces typically handle businesses that can't adapt to changing technological requirements. Without their subsidized access to cutting-edge legal technology, their associates had been forced to return to manual document review processes that tripled their research time and quadrupled their error rates. Their competitive advantage in the legal marketplace, the advantage that had been quietly subsidized by my technology and my family loyalty, had evaporated faster than a startup's runway in a venture capital winter. Some evenings, I pour myself one finger of Macallan 25-year-old single malt and stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Soho loft, looking out at a city that glows like a massive spreadsheet full of opportunities and possibilities. The whiskey is still excellent, but it tastes better when you're drinking it to celebrate your own achievements rather than to numb the pain of being systematically diminished by people who should have been supporting your success. I think about 4 words that completely changed my life. To the last time. Those words marked the boundary between the person I used to be, the disappointment with feelings who was willing to tolerate emotional abuse in exchange for social acceptance, and the person I became. Someone who understands that truth is a good portfolio strategy because it's diversified, protected, and compounds over time. The legal industry has always been slow to embrace technological innovation, but artificial intelligence and machine learning are revolutionary forces that don't particularly care about tradition or family legacy or the way things have always been done. Lex Pilot's success isn't just a business victory. It's proof that competence and innovation will always eventually triumph over inherited privilege and institutional inertia, regardless of how many generations of judicial authority are backing the status quo. I didn't burn bridges when I left the Whitmore family orbit. Burning bridges is emotional, destructive, and creates unnecessary legal exposure. Instead, I bought the river. I acquired controlling interests in the infrastructure that had been supporting their comfortable lifestyle, and then I redirected that infrastructure to serve my interests rather than theirs. It's a much more elegant solution that creates long-term value rather than short-term satisfaction. Harold still sends Christmas cards, which arrive at my corporate address and get handled by my assistant according to our standard protocol for unsolicited correspondence from former business associates. Sloane's LinkedIn profile occasionally surfaces in my professional network suggestions, reminding me that some people take longer to update their relationship status than others. The Whitmore family continues to exist in their reduced circumstances, probably still making jokes about disappointments and tech hobbies, blissfully unaware that the disappointment has moved on to bigger and better things. Truth turns out to be an excellent investment strategy, diversified across multiple asset classes, protected by proper legal documentation, and designed to compound wealth rather than compound resentment. Some portfolios are built to generate income. Others are built to generate respect. The best ones do both.